Tonight, we begin with a strike Kremlin officials who had publicly declared impossible. A strike Western intelligence agency tracked in real time and Ukrainian special forces executed with surgical precision. Not on distant front lines, not in occupied territory, but in the heart of Moscow itself, within sight of the Kremlin walls. One night that brought fire to the Russian capital. One night that forced Vladimir Putin to say a word he has avoided for 3 years: losses. One night that proved no corner of Russia is beyond Ukraine's reach. What Ukraine carried out tonight crossed a threshold Moscow believed was untouchable. And when that threshold was breached, Putin did not respond with his usual bluster. He did not threaten nuclear escalation. He did not promise swift revenge. Instead, he stood before cameras and, for the first time since this war began, acknowledged that Russia was suffering. Ukraine struck with precision, with intelligence that should terrify every Russian official, and with a message that echoed through the halls of the Kremlin itself. This war will be fought on our terms, not yours. For weeks, there had been indicators. Not official Ukrainian announcements, not public briefings. Just signs that Kyiv was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been aggressive in striking Russian territory, yes, but that aggression has been calculated. Their operations followed a logic, a doctrine, almost a predictable pattern targeting military infrastructure, while avoiding anything that could be interpreted as a direct threat to Moscow. Oil refineries, ammunition depots, airfields, command posts, all legitimate military targets, all outside the capital. What triggered alarm inside the Kremlin this week was that the pattern abruptly shifted. Intelligence officers monitoring Ukrainian drone capabilities recognized the warning signs. There was a sudden rise in reconnaissance flights over western Russia and some unusual testing of long-range systems near the border. Even more concerning, the disappearance of known Ukrainian special operations units from their usual positions. And then, the most telling sign of all, silence. Intelligence networks that had been actively communicating for months went dark 72 hours ago. And, when Ukraine's most elite units go dark, it means something extraordinary is underway. Something that cannot risk detection. Something aimed at the core of Russian power. Early this morning, at approximately 3:15 Moscow time, residents in central Moscow reported multiple explosions near the Kremlin district. Within minutes, videos flooded Russian social media showing fires burning in buildings less than 2 kilometers from Red Square. This was not random. This was not a failed drone drifting off course. This was a precision strike, the kind of operation Ukraine reserves for moments when it wants to send an unmistakable message. We can reach you, we know where your centers of power are, and we can hit them when we choose. Western intelligence officials initially believed the strike might be symbolic, dramatic but limited in real damage. Within hours, that assessment was completely revised. Ukrainian forces had struck at least 3 significant targets inside the Kremlin district, including what analysts believe was a military coordination center operating under civilian cover. When a nation at war demonstrates it can hit military targets inside an enemy capital, within sight of the leader's residence, the psychological impact cannot be overstated. The Kremlin's response tonight was not what anyone expected. It was not defiant. It was not threatening. For the first time in this war, it was subdued. Vladimir Putin, in a hastily arranged address, described the strikes as provocative and escalatory, and then said something that stopped analysts cold. He acknowledged losses. That word matters. But acknowledgement only matters if it signals a shift. And tonight, there are indications something inside the Kremlin has changed. Here's what we know. Within hours of the strikes, Russian air defense systems around Moscow were placed on their highest alert status, a level not maintained since the early days of the war. Emergency security protocols were activated across the capital. And Russian state media, usually quick to spin any incident as a failed terrorist act, remained largely silent for more than 4 hours. That silence speaks louder than propaganda ever could. Tonight, Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed what Western agencies had already concluded. This operation was months in the making. Ukraine struck before Russian air defenses could adapt to new approach vectors. They hit a communications relay linking Kremlin leadership to frontline commanders. They struck a logistics coordination center disguised as a civilian facility. They targeted sites Russian security services believed were invisible, untouchable. Ukraine didn't just strike Moscow. They demonstrated deep intelligence penetration at the highest levels of Russian security, the ability to identify concealed military facilities, the ability to track their operations, the ability to hit them with precision, minimizing civilian casualties while maximizing strategic effect. This is why Putin's admission of losses matters. Russia's carefully crafted image of an impenetrable capital has been shattered. And, Ukraine achieved this not through massive bombardment, but through surgical precision that left Russian defenses looking helpless. Not reckless, not indiscriminate, but with a targeted capability that leaves every Russian official wondering what else Ukraine knows and what else it can reach. And this is where the story becomes even more significant. Military analysts now believe the strike on the Kremlin district was designed to exploit a critical vulnerability in Russian psychology, the belief that Moscow was a sanctuary. For 3 years, residents of the capital lived largely normal lives, while Ukrainian cities were devastated. That asymmetry was central to Putin's domestic strategy. The war happens far away. Life at home continues. The costs remain abstract. Tonight, Ukraine made those costs real. Fires visible from the Kremlin, explosions echoing through central Moscow. The war arriving for the first time at doorsteps that believed themselves safe. Defense analysts speaking to Western media described Russia's security posture as psychologically shattered, forced to confront a reality long denied. One former intelligence officer summed it up this way: Ukraine didn't just strike physical targets tonight, they struck the myth that Putin could protect his own capital. And that matters, because it shows Ukraine is fighting a psychological war just as effectively as a military one. They are showing Russian citizens that this war has consequences. They are proving to Russian officials that nowhere is truly safe, and they are sending a message directly to Putin himself: your walls cannot protect you. As reports continued to come in throughout the morning, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's operation. Ukrainian long-range drones penetrated Russian airspace through corridors Moscow's vaunted air defenses failed to cover, forcing emergency scrambles of interceptor aircraft. Ukrainian cyber units reportedly disrupted Moscow's emergency communication systems for nearly 30 minutes, delaying a coordinated response. Ukrainian intelligence then released precise coordinates of the targets after the strikes, demonstrating they knew exactly what they were hitting, and why. This wasn't just a drone attack. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was a coordinated, multi-domain operation executed at the highest level of military sophistication. Ukraine was demonstrating capabilities Russia did not believe it possessed. And, capability demonstration is the one thing Russia has consistently underestimated throughout this war. For every defensive measure Russia has deployed, Ukraine has found a way around it. For every assumption Russia has made about Ukrainian limits, Ukraine has proven them wrong. Remember, Putin believed Moscow was untouchable. He believed his air defenses were impenetrable. He believed the war would remain safely distant from Russian population centers. Tonight, the exact opposite happened. Ukrainian precision weapons struck targets inside the capital itself. Russian air defenses failed to stop the attack, and Putin was forced to acknowledge losses in a way he never has before. This is not the invincible Russia portrayed by state propaganda. This is a nation suddenly vulnerable in ways its leadership never imagined. What makes this moment so dangerous is the timing. This strike occurred while Vladimir Putin is under immense internal pressure. Military commanders want more resources for a war-consuming men and equipment at unsustainable rates. Oligarchs want relief from sanctions that have gutted their fortunes. Security officials want answers for how Ukrainian weapons reached the capital. And the Russian public is waking up to videos of their city burning. Putin is balancing these impossible demands as his image of strength collapses. And when leaders in that position face public humiliation, they rarely respond rationally. They respond from wounded pride. They respond from desperation. They respond with escalation designed to restore an image of power that has just been punctured. NATO's statement tonight was carefully calibrated to achieve 2 goals: to support Ukraine's right to strike legitimate military targets, and to warn Russia against disproportionate escalation. Officials emphasized that Ukraine struck military coordination facilities, not civilian infrastructure. That distinction matters under international law, and it signals that Ukraine is fighting this war within boundaries Russia has repeatedly violated. You don't hear that kind of careful language from NATO unless they want to reinforce the legitimacy of Ukraine's actions while preparing for possible Russian retaliation. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed his nation with a measured but powerful statement. He said, "Russia believed their capital was beyond our reach. Tonight we proved them wrong." He added, "Every military target that supports the occupation of our land is a legitimate target. Distance does not provide immunity. And finally, we did not start this war, but we will take it wherever necessary to end it." These are the words of a leader who understands the magnitude of what Ukraine has just achieved. This strike did not happen in isolation. Alongside the attack on the Kremlin district, Ukrainian forces launched coordinated strikes against Russian military positions in occupied Crimea. Ukrainian cyber operations disrupted Russian command networks across multiple sectors. Ukrainian intelligence released information suggesting they possess detailed knowledge of additional high-value targets inside Russia. When Ukraine moves on multiple fronts at once, it signals that a new phase of the war has begun. Analysts are now weighing several possibilities. One is that Russia will dramatically escalate attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure in retaliation. Another is that Russian security services will launch sweeping internal investigations to hunt for intelligence leaks. A third is that Putin, humiliated and under pressure, may consider options a more secure leader would never contemplate. But tonight, Ukraine demonstrated something critical. They are willing to take risks Russia did not anticipate. What we are witnessing now is a battle of narratives. Russia wants to maintain the fiction that this war has no domestic consequences. Ukraine wants to prove that fiction is over. NATO wants to manage escalation while supporting Ukrainian operations. And the world wants to know whether this strike marks a turning point in a conflict that has already reshaped global security. As the hours pass, more details will emerge about exactly what Ukraine struck and how much damage was inflicted. But what we already know is decisive. Ukraine reached the Russian capital with precision weapons. Putin publicly acknowledged losses for the first time. And, honestly, Moscow's image of invincibility has been shattered. What happens next depends on decisions being made inside the Kremlin right now. But Ukraine has already proven it can strike whenever and wherever it chooses. And tonight, for the first time since this war began, Moscow is afraid. Not the distant front lines, not occupied territory, Moscow itself. Because tonight, Ukraine taught Russia something it will never forget. This war has no safe zones. Distance offers no protection. And the Russian capital can burn just as Ukrainian cities have burned. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is undeniable. Ukraine reached Moscow. Putin admitted losses. And the war just changed. Forever.